The sun always seemed to struggle to reach the window of the third-floor walk-up on 42nd Street. It was a narrow, dusty building that sat right in the middle of the noise and chaos of the city. Most people walked past it every day without looking up. They were too busy rushing to their jobs or yelling into their phones. But for the people who lived inside that building, and specifically for the families on the third floor, that apartment was a place of terror and intense focus. It was the home of Madame Alara. Alara was not a large woman. In fact, she was quite small and thin, with a posture that was permanently bent forward, as if she was constantly looking for something she had dropped on the floor. Her hair was a steely gray color, pulled back into such a tight bun that it pulled at the corners of her eyes. She always wore long sleeves, even in the middle of July, and thick, dark stockings that covered her legs. To look at her, you would think she was just another elderly woman trying to get by in a tough city. But the moment she sat down in front of her old black piano, she changed. The piano was the only thing in the room that looked like it was truly loved. It was a massive instrument, dark as ebony, with a sheen that Alara polished until she could see her reflection in it. The rest of the apartment was crowded with sheet music stacks, dusty metronomes, and chairs that looked like they came from a trash heap. Parents would come in and look around with skeptical eyes, wondering why they were paying so much money for lessons in a place that looked so plain. But then Alara would play. When she played, the air in the room seemed to change. Her hands, which were usually hidden in her pockets or folded in her lap, would move like lightning. She didn't just hit the keys. She commanded them. The sound was rich and loud enough to make the windows rattle. It was the kind of music that made you stop talking and hold your breath. However, the students rarely heard Alara play for long. Her style of teaching was not about performing for them. It was about demanding perfection from them. She was known as the Iron Maestro of the neighborhood. And she was scary. 7-year-old Timmy was currently shaking in his shoes. He sat on the hard piano bench, his legs barely touching the floor. He had his hands resting on the keys, trying to remember the piece he had practiced all week. It was a simple song meant for beginners. But to Timmy, it felt like climbing a mountain. It wasn't a yell, but it was sharp and cut through the air like a knife, like you were holding a small orange. Do not let them collapse. Timmy jumped. He straightened his fingers and took a deep breath. He started to play. The notes came out slowly and unevenly. C, D, E, F. He was doing okay until his left hand missed a note. A sour, clashing sound echoed through the small room. Timmy froze. He squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the sound of the ruler. Alara stood right next to him. She held a thin wooden ruler in her right hand. It was painted yellow and had seen better days. She tapped it rhythmically against her own palm. Tap, tap, tap. That note, Alara said softly, was not in the music you were given. Was it? No, Madame Alara, Timmy whispered. He felt tears stinging the corners of his eyes. He didn't want to be there. He wanted to be outside playing baseball with his friends. But his mother insisted that piano lessons would make him smarter. She said Alara was the best teacher in the city, despite her reputation. Start again. From the measure before the mistake, Alara commanded. She did not hit him this time, but the threat was always there. She believed that pain was a good way to remember where your fingers were supposed to go. Timmy wiped his nose on his sleeve and started again. The lesson went on for another 30 minutes. It felt like 30 years to the young boy. Every time he made a mistake, the rhythm of the ruler tapping against Alara's hand would get faster. Every time he slouched, she would poke him in the back with the end of it until he sat up straight, in the hallway outside the door. Other parents waited their turn. They sat on folding chairs, flipping through magazines or checking their watches. They could hear the shouting and the crying through the thin wooden door. They could hear the ruler smacking against the wood of the piano. When a student was really struggling, any normal person would hear that and call the police. But these parents didn't. They looked at each other with secret smiles of satisfaction. To them, the noise meant that Alara was doing her job. She is a genius, Timmy's mother whispered to the man next to her, whose daughter was also taking a lesson. My Timmy couldn't even read music 3 months ago. Now, he can play Bach. It is a miracle. The man nodded in agreement. "It is worth a few tears," he said. "My daughter played at the school talent show last week. Everyone was amazed. You cannot get that kind of discipline anywhere else." They were right. The results were impossible to ignore. Every student who came out of Alara's apartment played like an angel. They won competitions. They got scholarships to fancy schools. Parents were willing to pay high prices and willing to ignore the tears because they wanted their children to be winners. They thought Alara was just a strict old lady who hated mistakes, but there was more to it than that. The other teachers in the city, the ones who used stickers and candy and happy songs, hated Alara. They said she was cruel. They said she broke the spirits of children, but they couldn't compete with her. She had a secret power that no one could understand. Alara never talked about her past. If you asked her where she learned to play, she would just stare at you with her cold, gray eyes until you looked away. If you asked her why she was so mean, she would simply say, "Music is not a game. It is life and death. If you cannot be perfect, you should not play at all." She lived alone. She had no photographs of family in her apartment. There were no toys, no television, no radio. There was only the piano and hundreds of books filled with notes that looked like ants crawling on a page. She seemed to exist in a bubble that was separate from the rest of the world. Sometimes, late at night, the neighbors could hear the piano playing. It wasn't the angry banging of a student. It was beautiful, flowing music that went on for hours. It was the kind of music that made people stop what they were doing and listen to the walls. Wondering who was playing with so much sadness? It was Alara, of course. She played alone in the dark. But no one knew why she sounded so sad when she played, why she refused to let anyone see the real her. To the world, she was just the Iron Maestro. The scary lady who made children cry and turned them into musicians? They respected her, but they didn't love her. They feared her, but they didn't know her. They only saw the harsh surface, like the hard wood of the piano bench. They didn't know what was hidden inside. As Timmy's lesson came to an end, Alara stood up and closed the lid of the piano with a loud thud. It signaled that the time was up. "Let's practice the scales," she said, not looking at him. "If your fingers are not stronger next week, do not come back." Timmy grabbed his backpack and ran out the door, relieved to be free. His mother gave Alara a handful of cash and bowed her head slightly in respect. Alara took the money without saying thank you. She just watched them leave, her face like a stone mask. She waited for the next student to knock. She didn't know it yet, but her life was about to change. She thought her biggest problem was a boy who couldn't keep his wrists up. She didn't know that danger was already walking up the stairs, not that in just a few days the terrifying teacher would be the one begging for mercy. But for now, she just walked to the window and watched the street below, waiting for the next lesson to begin. The week had passed just like every other week in the old building. The stairs had creaked under the feet of nervous students carrying heavy instrument cases. The shouts of "wrong again" and "focus" had drifted out from under the apartment door, making the neighbors shake their heads but smile knowingly. To them, the noise of the piano lessons was the heartbeat of the building. It was normal. It was safe, but Tuesday evening felt different. It was one of those humid summer nights where the air feels heavy and sticky, making it hard to breathe. The city smelled like hot garbage and exhaust fumes. Even the noise outside seemed louder and more angry than usual. Car horns were blaring nonstop, and sirens wailed in the distance. Adding to the tension in the air, inside the studio, the lesson was dragging on. 7-year-old Timmy was exhausted. It was his third time trying to get through the same difficult part of his song, and his brain was fried. Madame Alara sat on her hard chair, leaning forward, her eyes boring into his back. She was not letting him give up. Even though the sun had gone down and the room was only lit by the yellow glow of the street lamp outside. "Curve your fingers." "Timmy, do not play like you are smashing potatoes," she scolded gently but firmly. She tapped her ruler on the music stand. Timmy sighed, a loud, dramatic sound that showed just how done he was. He lifted his hands to try again, but before his fingers could touch the keys, the sound of the apartment door exploding inward shattered the silence. It wasn't a knock. It was a crash. The wood around the lock splintered with a sickening crack and the heavy door flew open, slamming against the wall with a bang that made Timmy jump off the bench. Standing in the doorway were two men. They were young, maybe in their early 20s, but they looked old in a way that comes from living on the streets and making bad choices. Their clothes were dirty, their hair was messy, and they smelled of sweat and fear. The taller one held a gun. It wasn't a big fancy gun like in the movies, but a small, rusty revolver that looked dangerous and unstable. His hand was shaking, and his eyes were wide, darting around the room like a trapped animal. The second man was shorter and heavier. He held a heavy crowbar in his fist, squeezing it so tight his knuckles were white. The tall one screamed. His voice cracked, making him sound more scared than scary. "Nobody move, or I swear." The room went dead silent. The only sound was the heavy, raspy breathing of the intruders. Timmy stood frozen by the piano, his face turning pale as a sheet. He didn't understand what was happening. He just knew that these men were not here for a piano lesson. Ilara, however, didn't scream. She didn't faint, and she didn't run. She sat very still on her chair, her hands resting in her lap. She looked at the men with a cold, steady gaze. She had seen violence before. She had seen men with guns and men with hate in their eyes a long time ago in a different world. She knew that panicking would only make things worse. "Get out." Timmy finally found his voice and let out a high-pitched scream. He turned and bolted toward the open door, ducking past the shorter man who was too surprised to stop him. "Timmy, run!" Ilara commanded, her voice cutting through the boy's panic. Timmy didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled into the hallway, tripping over his own feet, and sprinted toward the stairs, screaming for his mother at the top of his lungs. His cries echoed down the stairwell, fading into the distance as he ran for his life. Now it was just Ilara. And the two men in the dusty room. The tall intruder stepped further into the room. Kicking a stack of sheet music out of his way, he pointed the gun directly at Ilara's chest. "Where is it?" he shouted. "Where do you keep the cash? Don't lie to me, old lady. We know people come here. We know you charge a lot." Ilara didn't blink. She stayed sitting, looking small in her chair. "I have no cash here," she said calmly. "I deposit it at the bank every morning." "You have made a mistake, Bull," the shorter man yelled. He walked over to the shelves and started sweeping books and trophies onto the floor. Crash, thud, smash. "Don't lie to us. We need the money, and we need it now." The tall man walked over to the piano. He looked at the big black instrument with disgust, as if it was just a large piece of junk taking up space. He turned back to Ilara, waving the gun threateningly. "Look, lady, we don't want to hurt you, but we're desperate. If you don't give us something valuable, we're going to take it out of your hide." Ilara looked at him. Her heart was beating fast, hammering against her ribs like a bird in a cage, but she forced herself to breathe slowly. She saw the sweat on his forehead and the way his hands were trembling. These weren't master criminals. They were just two desperate fools who were in way over their heads. That made them dangerous, but it also meant they might listen to reason. "Take the piano," she said. "It is worth money. Take the metronomes. Take anything in the drawers. But do not hurt me." The shorter man stopped ransacking the shelves and looked at his partner. "We can't take a piano, you idiot. How are we going to carry a piano down 3 flights of stairs?" The tall man's face turned red with frustration. He knew his friend was right. The realization that they might leave empty-handed made him angry. He looked around the room wildly. His eyes landed on the mantelpiece above the piano. Sitting there was a heavy bronze bust of Beethoven. It was dusty and old, but it was solid metal. He grabbed it, testing its weight. It was heavy enough to kill someone. "I want the safe," the tall man insisted, stepping closer to Ilara. He was looming over her now, close enough that she could smell his sour breath. "Rich old ladies always have a safe." "Where is it?" "In the floor, behind a painting." "I told you," Ilara said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming hard as stone. "There is no safe," the man snapped. He couldn't handle the rejection. He slammed the heavy bronze bust down onto the top of the piano, inches from Ilara's hands. The metal rang out like a church bell, vibrating through the floorboards. Don't play games with me, he roared. Alara didn't flinch away from the noise. Instead, she did something that shocked both men. She didn't beg for her life. She didn't promise to find money that didn't exist. She quickly pulled her hands off her lap and tucked them against her chest, hiding them under her chin. She looked at the man with eyes that suddenly looked very, very old and very tired. Please, she whispered. The word hung in the air. It wasn't the loud begging of a coward. It was a desperate, heartfelt plea. The tall man paused, confused by her reaction. Most people were covering their heads or cowering on the floor, but she was protecting her hands. What? He asked, squinting at her. What are you doing? Alara looked down at her own hands, which were clenched tightly together in a prayer-like position. She looked back at the man, her eyes filling with tears that she refused to let fall. Please, she said again, her voice trembling. Have mercy. Not my hands. Please don't let anything happen to my hands. The intruders looked at each other. They didn't understand. To them, hands were just hands. You used them to hold things, to punch things, to grab money. They couldn't understand why this old woman was begging for her hands when there was a gun pointed at her head. They thought it was some kind of trick, or maybe she was just crazy. You old weirdo, the short man muttered, laughing nervously. She's worried about her hands, the tall man sneered, enjoying the power he had over her. He saw her fear as a weakness. He lifted the bronze bust again, holding it high above her fragile fingers. Oh, you care about these? He mocked her. You think these hands are special? You think they're worth more than the money you owe us? Alara squeezed her eyes shut. She couldn't look. She pressed her hands harder against her chest, trying to make herself as small as possible. Don't, she gasped. I will give you anything else, just not the hands. The room was filled with a terrible tension. The dust motes danced in the yellow light, oblivious to the drama unfolding below. The city noise outside continued, the cars honking and people laughing, completely unaware that a life was about to be broken in that small apartment. The tall man's grip on the bust tightened. He was enjoying her fear too much to stop now. He wanted to break something. He wanted to wipe that calm look off her face forever. Should have given us the money, he growled, and he began to bring his arm down, aiming right for her delicate fingers. The heavy bronze statue hung in the air for what felt like a lifetime, just above Madame Alara's fragile fingers. Time seemed to slow down in the dusty room. Alara squeezed her eyes shut, her breath caught in her throat, waiting for the crushing pain that would end her life's purpose. But the blow never came, just as the tall man's arm began its deadly descent. The front door of the apartment crashed open a second time. This time, it wasn't kicked by an intruder, but thrown open by a man in a panic. It was Timmy's father. He had been waiting in the hallway, likely checking his watch or scrolling on his phone. When his screaming son had burst out of the stairwell, the boy had told him everything. Men with guns, shouting, the crash of the door. The father didn't stop to think. He didn't call the police first. He just reacted. He charged into the room, his face red with protective rage. Get away from her! He roared, his voice booming louder than the gunshot that would follow. The tall intruder was startled by the sudden noise. He flinched, jerking his arm to the side. The heavy bronze bust missed Ilara's hands and smashed down onto the keys of the piano instead. Crunch. The sound was sickening, a mix of wood snapping and metal strings clashing violently. The noise was so loud it rang in everyone's ears like a fire alarm. The shock broke the spell that had held Alara frozen. She didn't wait to see what would happen next. Adrenaline surged through her old veins. She wasn't thinking about her dignity or her strict rules anymore. She was fighting for her life. As the tall man turned to face the new threat, Alara made a split-second decision. She knew she couldn't outrun them. She knew she couldn't fight them with strength. But she could protect her hands. She scooted backward on the bench, kicking her legs out to scramble away. She grabbed her wrists and pulled her arms tight against her chest, curling into a ball to shield her fingers. The tall man, realizing the situation was spiraling out of control, panicked. He wasn't a professional criminal. He was a desperate addict with a stolen gun. He pointed the weapon toward the door where the father was standing. "Back off." The intruder screamed, his voice high and shaky. "I'll shoot. I'll shoot you." The father froze, halfway across the room. He saw the gun, and for a second, fear rooted him to the spot. But he didn't retreat. He stood his ground, glancing at Alara to make sure she was okay. Alara was not okay. She was still on the floor, tangled in the piano bench. The shorter man, seeing his partner losing control, decided to act. He lunged forward, grabbing at Alara's shoulder to drag her up. He thought she might know where a safe was. Or maybe he just wanted a human shield. "Get up," he yelled, his fingers digging into her arm. Alara let out a guttural scream. It wasn't a scream of pain, but a primal noise of defiance. She kicked out with her heavy black shoe, catching the man in the shin. He howled in pain and stumbled back. The tall man, hearing the commotion behind him, turned back around wildly. He was confused, angry, and terrified. The gun waved in the air like a deadly wand. He saw the woman on the floor, fighting his friend, and he saw the father moving toward him. The pressure was too much. His finger slipped. Bang! A single gunshot exploded in the small room. The sound was deafening, louder than the piano crash. It was a sharp, terrifying crack that seemed to suck the air out of the space. The bullet didn't hit anyone. It smashed into the large vase sitting on the mantelpiece, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. Dust and ceramic shards flew into the air. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. The smoke from the gun barrel curled up toward the ceiling, smelling like burnt sulfur. Then chaos erupted. The tall intruder dropped the gun. It was too hot, too heavy, and the reality of what he had just done hit him like a truck. He hadn't meant to shoot. He just wanted to scare them. The realization that he could have killed someone paralyzed him. He looked at his hands, shaking uncontrollably, and then looked at Lara. She was still on the floor, her face pale white, her hands still clutched against her chest. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the piano keys where the bronze bust had smashed them. The jagged edges of wood and broken ivory looked like broken teeth. The shorter man wasn't paralyzed. He was fueled by fear. He grabbed his partner by the sleeve. "Let's go. Let's go. The cops will be here." "We gotta move." The tall man snapped out of it. He scrambled toward the door, pushing past the father, who was covering his head from the falling plaster. The intruders didn't bother to close the door. They didn't bother to grab anything else. They fled down the hallway, their footsteps thundering down the stairs, tripping and cursing as they ran. In the apartment, the silence rushed back in. It was a heavy, ringing silence. The only sound was the harsh, ragged breathing of Timmy's father and the soft whimpering coming from the floor. Alara didn't move. She stayed curled in a ball on the dirty rug, her body shaking violently. The father rushed over to her, dropping to his knees. "Madame Alara, are you hit? Did he shoot you?" he asked, his voice trembling. He was scared to touch her, scared to find blood. She slowly shook her head. She couldn't speak yet. She was trying to force her heart to slow down. She slowly, carefully uncurled her arms. She looked at her hands. They were shaking, but they were intact. No bones were broken. No blood was spilled. The father let out a long sigh of relief and slumped back against the piano bench. "Thank God," he whispered. "They're gone. They're gone." By now, other neighbors had heard the gunshot. The hallway was filling with voices, shouting, asking questions, crying. 2 men from the floor below rushed into the room, followed by an older woman who lived down the hall. They stopped when they saw the smashed vase, the overturned bench, and Alara on the floor. "Call the police," the father barked at them, suddenly finding his authority again. "They went down the fire escape or the back stairs. Hurry." One of the neighbors ran back to the hall to use the phone. The others gathered around Alara, offering her water, trying to help her stand up. "Here, lean on me," the older woman said gently, reaching out to take Alara's arm. Alara flinched. She pulled her arm back quickly, shielding her hand again. It was a reflex, swift and sharp. The neighbor looked hurt, confused by the reaction. "It's okay, dear. We are here to help," the neighbor said softly. Ilara looked at them with wild eyes, still coming down from the terror. She took a deep breath, trying to jaw-hui her composure. She was the Iron Maestro. She was the woman who never showed fear. She couldn't let them see her like this. She slowly reached out and grabbed the edge of the piano bench to pull herself up. She stood on shaky legs. She dusted off her long skirt, trying to smooth out the wrinkles with hands that still wouldn't stop trembling. She looked around the room at the mess. The sheet music was scattered everywhere. Her beautiful piano was scarred with a deep gash from the bronze statue. The vase her mother had given her was gone, but she was alive, and her hands were safe. "I'm fine," she said, her voice raspy but firm. She tried to stand up straight, pushing her shoulders back. "I am not hurt." The father looked at her with a mixture of awe and pity. He had seen how she curled up to protect her hands. He didn't understand it, but he knew it was important to her. "You were brave," he said. "I came as fast as I could." "You came in time," Ilara replied. She walked over to the window, wanting to put some distance between herself and the crowd. She looked out at the street below. Red and blue lights were flashing against the building fronts. The sirens were getting closer. The police were coming. She turned back to the room, her eyes scanning the destruction. The tall intruder's boot print was still visible in the dust on the floor where he had stood over her. She remembered the words he had sneered at her. "Asterisk, you think these hands are special?" Asterisk, the memory of his voice made her shiver. He had been ready to crush them. He had laughed at her plea. He had tried to destroy the only thing she had left in the world that mattered. And now, surrounded by her neighbors, with the police sirens wailing outside, she realized the fight wasn't over. The secret of her hands was still safe, but the walls of her apartment had been breached. The sanctuary she had built for 40 years was broken. She looked down at her right hand. She slowly opened and closed her fingers, watching the tendons move under the skin. She felt the phantom pain of the blows that never landed. She took a deep breath and prepared to face the police, knowing that tonight, for the first time in decades, she might have to explain exactly why an old piano teacher would beg for mercy over something as simple as her hands. The flashing red and blue lights from the police cruisers spun wildly against the dusty windows of the apartment, turning the room into a strobe light disco of shadows. The sirens had stopped wailing, but the silence that replaced them was heavy with tension. 2 uniformed officers were walking through the small studio, stepping over scattered sheet music and broken glass. Asking questions and taking notes, Ilara sat on the hard wooden chair she usually reserved for students, but tonight she was the one being watched. She had wrapped a gray shawl tightly around her shoulders, clutching it closed at her neck. She looked small and frail, a sharp contrast to the terrifying woman who usually ruled this room with a ruler. Timmy's father stood near the door, giving his statement to a detective, occasionally looking over at Ilara with a mixture of concern and confusion. I'm telling you." "They were crazy," the father was saying, his hand still shaking slightly as he spoke. "They smashed the vase. They had a gun. But the strangest thing, the way she begged, it didn't make sense." The detective, a tired-looking man with a thick mustache, nodded and walked over to Ilara. He held a notepad in one hand and offered a sympathetic look. "I know this is hard," the detective said gently, "but we need to get the details right for the report. You said one of the men grabbed you?" Ilara looked up at him. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear. "He tried to grab my hands," she said softly. "He wanted to hurt them." The detective frowned. He looked down at her hands, which were currently resting on her lap, covered by the edge of the shawl. "Did he hurt you? Do you need an ambulance?" "We can check for broken bones." Ilara pulled her hands away quickly, hiding them deeper under the wool fabric. "No bones are broken. I am fine. It's just strange, is all," the detective mumbled, more to himself than to her. Usually, people beg for their lives, or for their children. You seemed most worried about your hands." Round the room, the neighbors who had stayed to help were listening. The tension from the robbery was fading, replaced by a new, burning curiosity. They all knew Ilara as the strict piano teacher. They knew she was harsh and demanded perfection. But they had never seen her vulnerable. They had never seen her afraid. As the officers finished taking photos of the smashed piano and the splintered door, the crowd in the apartment began to settle down. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving everyone exhausted. The detective sighed and put his notebook away. Right, folks. Unless you can give a description of the car they might have used, there isn't much more we can do tonight. We have an alert out. Try to get some rest. The police began to file out. Timmy's father shook Alara's hand, or tried to, but she offered only her elbow, which he awkwardly patted. He promised to come by the next day to fix the door. He thanked her again for keeping his son safe, even though she had been the one in danger. Then he left, taking the noise and the energy with him. Slowly, the apartment emptied out. The neighbors went back to their own homes, closing their doors to gossip about the night's events. Soon, only Alara and the old man from down the hall remained. His name was Mr. Klein. He was a quiet man, mostly known for feeding the stray cats in the alley. He had been standing in the corner the whole time, watching. He hadn't said a word to the police. Now, as the room quieted down, he stepped forward. He didn't look at Alara with pity, like the others had. He looked at her with a strange kind of recognition. "I can help you clean up," Mr. Klein said, his voice gravelly. Alara shook her head. "You should go home, Mr. Klein. It is late." He didn't move. He walked over to the piano and looked at the broken keys. He reached out to touch the jagged wood but stopped. "They were going to smash your fingers," he said. It wasn't a question. Alara stiffened. "I do not want to talk about it." "I saw how you held them," he continued, turning to look at her. "I remember that look." Alara closed her eyes for a moment. She was tired. So incredibly tired. For 40 years she had built a wall around herself. She had been the iron maestro, the untouchable teacher. But tonight, that wall had been cracked by a panicked intruder with a bronze statue. She knew she couldn't just go back to being the mystery woman tomorrow. Too many people had seen her fear. She sighed, a long rattling sound, and let her shoulders drop. She slowly pulled her hands out from under the shawl. The room was dim, lit only by the streetlights outside. She extended her arms, palms up, toward Mr. Klein. "If you are going to stay," she whispered, "then look." Mr. Klein stepped closer. He leaned in, squinting in the low light. What he saw made him gasp softly. Alara's hands were not like other hands. They were strong, yes, with the long, elegant fingers of a pianist. But the skin was a roadmap of suffering. There were thick, raised scars running along her forearms, disappearing under the sleeves of her dress. On the backs of her hands, the skin was shiny and tight, twisted in patterns that looked like melted wax. These were not scars from a cooking accident or a fall down the stairs. They were old, deep burns. They were the marks of cruelty that had been inflicted a lifetime ago. Mr. Klein stared at them for a long time. He reached out with his own trembling hand and hovered it over hers, not touching, just acknowledging. "I knew it," he whispered. "I thought I recognized the markings. My father. He had numbers on his arm. But these were not a number," Alara said, her voice gaining strength as she finally spoke the truth. "These were a punishment." She turned her hands over, looking at the scars as if they were old friends. She remembered the cold winter of 1944. She was just a girl then, locked in a place where hope was illegal. The camp guards knew she played music. They took her to the officers' quarters to play for their dinners. It was the only reason she was kept alive. But one night, she made a mistake. She played a forbidden song, a lullaby her mother used to sing to her. The officer was furious. He said she was polluting the air with Jewish trash. He didn't kill her. Death was too easy. He wanted to break her spirit. They held her hands over a stove in the kitchen. They burned the skin until she screamed, until she promised never to play that song again. They told her that if she ever played beautifully again, they would cut off her fingers. She survived the camp. She escaped. She came to this country with nothing but the memory of that pain. And for years, she didn't play. She couldn't stand to look at her hands. But eventually, the music called her back. It was the only way she could speak to the family she had lost. She played for the dead. She played for the memories. I promised myself that no matter what happened, Alara said, tears finally spilling over her cheeks, I would keep these hands safe. I survived the fire. I survived the camp. I was not going to let two common thugs destroy the only thing the Nazis could not kill. Mr. Klein was crying now, too. He reached out and gently took one of her scarred hands between his own two rough workers' hands. He didn't care about the scars. He held it with reverence. You are the bravest woman I have ever met, he choked out. All these years, we thought you were mean. We thought you were just cruel, but you were protecting them. Alara looked at their neighbor. A strange feeling washed over her. For the first time in decades, she didn't feel alone. She felt the weight of her secret lifting, replaced by a quiet dignity. They are not pretty hands, she said softly. They are beautiful hands, because they survived. He gently let go of her hand and looked around the messy room. Come, he said. Let me help you pick up this music. The piano can be fixed. It is strong, just like you. Alara nodded. She took a deep breath, wiped her face, and stood up. The Iron Maestro was gone. In her place stood a woman who had walked through hell and came out playing music. She reached down and picked up a fallen sheet of paper, smoothing it out with her scarred palm. The room was silent, but it wasn't an empty silence anymore. It was full of understanding. The sun finally rose over the city, casting long golden beams through the dusty windows of the apartment. It had been 3 days since the robbery. The shattered vase had been swept away. The door had been reinforced with a new, heavy lock. The bronze bust of Beethoven had been polished and placed back on the shelf. To anyone else, the room looked the same. But the people who lived in the building knew that everything had changed. The word had spread quickly. It wasn't gossip in a nasty way. It was a story of awe passed from neighbor to neighbor, from parent to parent. They knew about the scars now. They knew why the Iron Maestro was so strict and why she loved the piano so much. The fear they used to feel had been replaced by a deep, quiet respect. It was Tuesday afternoon again. Time for the lessons to begin. 7-year-old Timmy sat on the piano bench, his legs swinging nervously. He hadn't played a note since the robbery. His mother had asked if he wanted to quit, to find a new teacher with a happier studio, and maybe some stickers for good behavior. But Timmy had surprised her. He said he wanted to come back. He said he had to finish what he started. Alara walked into the room. She was wearing her usual dark dress with her hair pulled back in its tight bun. She looked stern as ever, but there was a new light in her eyes. She didn't look at the floor. She looked straight at Timmy. "Good afternoon, Timmy," she said. Her voice was calm, not sharp. "Good afternoon, Madame Alara," Timmy replied. He looked at the piano keys. They were the same keys he had always played, but now they looked different to him. They looked like something precious. "Put your hands on the keys," Alara instructed. She walked around behind him. She didn't have the ruler in her hand today. Her hands were empty. Timmy placed his small fingers on the white ivory. He took a deep breath. "Remember," Alara said softly, leaning down so her face was near his ear. "Music is not just noise. It is history. It is feeling. When you play, you must play with your whole heart. Do not be afraid of the mistakes. Just play." Timmy closed his eyes. He thought about the loud noise of the door breaking. He thought about the bad men. But then he thought about how brave Alara was. He thought about how she protected her hands because the music inside them was too important to lose. He felt a sudden burst of courage. He started to play. It wasn't perfect. He missed a note in the second measure, and his rhythm wobbled a little. But he didn't stop. He kept going, putting more force into the song than he ever had before. He played like he was trying to chase away the shadows in the room. Alara listened. She watched his hands. She saw the effort he was making. A small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth, a smile that no one had seen in 40 years. She didn't correct him. She didn't scold him. She let the music fill the room. When Timmy finished, he let out a huge breath and looked up at her. "Did I do okay?" Alara reached out and gently touched his shoulder. "You played like a warrior, Timmy. That was beautiful." Timmy beamed. He felt like he had won a trophy, Over the next few weeks, the atmosphere in the building changed completely. Parents used to drop their children off and rush away to get coffee or run errands, glad to escape the tense energy of the studio. Now they stayed. They would sit on the folding chairs in the hallway, listening through the open door. They didn't hear shouting anymore. They heard singing. They heard Alara telling stories, not scary ones, but stories about the composers. She told them why Beethoven wrote passionate music when he couldn't hear the world. She told them why Chopin's music sounded like rain. She was letting the students see the magic behind the notes. One afternoon, Mr. Klein, the neighbor from down the hall, came up to the apartment. He wasn't there for a lesson. He was carrying a small, potted plant. He set it down on the windowsill next to the piano. For some color, he said simply. Alara looked at the bright red flowers, and then at the old man. "You are too kind, Mr. Klein," I was thinking, Mr. Klein said, scratching his chin. "We have a talent show coming up at the community center next month. Usually the kids play simple songs, but I was thinking, maybe you could play? For us? For the neighborhood?" Alara froze. The idea of playing in public again terrified her. She had hidden her hands for so long. The thought of standing on a stage with hundreds of eyes looking at her scars, it made her heart race. "I don't know," she said. "My hands. They are not what they used to be." "They are better," Mr. Klein said firmly. "They have survived. That makes them stronger than any hands out there. People need to hear that, Alara. They need to hear the music that comes from pain and turns into something beautiful." Alara looked at her hands. She turned them over, looking at the shiny, twisted skin. She remembered the dark, cold nights in the camp when she hummed songs to keep herself warm. She realized that hiding the music was like hiding her survival. She owed it to the people who didn't make it to play loud and clear. "I will play," she whispered. The night of the talent show, the community center was packed. The room was hot and filled with the smell of popcorn and perfume. There were children dancing, people singing, and even a man juggling apples. Everyone cheered and clapped. But when the announcer called out, "And now, a special performance by our very own Madame Alara," the room went completely silent. Alara walked onto the small stage. She was wearing her best black dress, and she had left her sleeves long, covering her arms. She didn't look at the audience. She walked straight to the piano and sat down. She placed her hands on the keys. From where they sat, the audience could only see her fingers. They looked a little stiff, a little different, but they looked ready. She didn't play a children's song. She played Beethoven. It was the Moonlight Sonata, a song that starts slow and sad, like a whisper, and then grows into a storm of sound. As her fingers moved, the people in the crowd stopped moving. They stopped eating their popcorn. They stopped checking their phones. The sound that came out of that piano was like nothing they had ever heard before. It wasn't just technical skill. It was full of a deep, aching sadness that transformed into a soaring, powerful hope. You could hear the years of silence, the fear, and the triumph in every note. When she played the loud parts, she played with the strength of a survivor. When she played the quiet parts, it sounded like a prayer. In the middle of the song, Mr. Klein stood up. He walked to the side of the stage, just where the spotlight hit the floor. He didn't block the view, but he stood there as a guard, a witness. Seeing him, Alara felt a wave of peace. She stopped thinking about her scars. She stopped worrying about what people thought. She closed her eyes and let her hands fly over the keys. Pouring her entire life story into the music, she played the final chord. It was a deep, resonant sound that seemed to hang in the air long after she lifted her hands. For 3 seconds, nobody made a sound. The silence was heavy and full of emotion. Then slowly, Mr. Klein began to clap. He clapped slowly, with respect. Suddenly, the entire room erupted. It wasn't just polite applause, it was a roar. The parents stood up, the children stood up. People were wiping tears from their eyes. They weren't clapping because she was a great pianist, although she was. They were clapping because they understood. They were honoring the woman who had walked through fire, came out with music in her hands. Alara sat at the bench for a moment, looking out at the crowd. She saw Timmy and his parents in the front row, cheering louder than anyone. She saw her neighbors, people she had ignored for years, smiling at her with love. She stood up and bowed. It was a small bow, graceful and dignified. She didn't say anything into the microphone. She didn't need to. The secret was out and the world hadn't ended. It had gotten better as she walked off the stage. With Mr. Klein holding her elbow to steady her, she knew the Iron Maestro was gone forever. She didn't need to be scary to protect her music anymore. Her hands had finally found a safe place. They were home.